Mr. Patrick Beck. Thanks, Connor. Hi, I'm Patrick. Yep, I go to Hopkins, and I've been getting a degree or two there for so long, and I'm really tired of it. But I've been studying some of this stuff, and there is some really interesting, if like dire, news out there in the world of modern healthcare and modern disease, especially infectious disease, although there's a lot of problems elsewhere. But tonight, we're going to talk about infectious disease. So, we currently live in the era of drug resistance, of antibiotic resistance. There are today fewer drugs that work effectively against infectious disease. There are more people getting sick and dying from antibiotic-resistant infections and complications. There's a wider variety of pathogens, bacteria that make people sick, that have acquired antibiotic-resistant characteristics. And the gene pool, we'll be talking a bit more about this, of drug resistance is becoming a lot larger and a lot more diverse. And in the face of all this, you might think that there's a huge amount of money being dumped into finding new drugs to treat infectious disease, because so many current drugs on the market are ineffective, but there's actually fewer research and development dollars going into developing new drugs today than there ever has been before, basically because they don't think they're going to find any new drugs anymore. They haven't developed a new patent for a new type of antibiotic in over 10 years, whereas in the 20 years before that, there were a dozen new patents on new types of antibiotics. So that's dire. But why is this happening? We are egregiously abusing antimicrobials in so many different ways and in so many different elements. The most obvious one is that antimicrobials are overprescribed in clinical medicine. They're the first line of defense for a lot of presentation of an infection. So they are just what is prescribed by doctors to patients in every healthcare setting across the country. But 80% of the antibiotics that we produce and use in the US actually go into livestock. And that's not only a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of that is veterinary medicine. Most of it just goes into feed because it promotes growth and shortens the time to market weight, and it's slightly more profitable for huge businesses to put low doses of antibiotics into the feed of chickens, swine, cows, you name it, because it makes them grow faster. Nobody really knows why exactly, but it does. And we have them in the host of soaps and Purell bottles and everything like that that is so ubiquitous throughout the world. All of those things contain antibiotics and antimicrobials. So why is overuse of antibiotics a really bad thing? Population-wide, all antibiotic use that anybody uses creates selective pressure for antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So because bacteria reproduce at a rate of going from like 2 to 1 million in 24 hours, they have this incredible ability to use natural selection to adapt to new and challenging environments. So you saturate the world in antibiotics, bacteria just find a way to reproduce and reproduce and reproduce until they come up with the genes that allow them to survive and keep reproducing in a world saturated by antibiotics. So every time that we use and put these things into our bodies and the environment, we create an environment that selects more and more and more for the bugs that will resist the drugs, instead of the ones that are killed off, because they die, and when you die, you stop reproducing. So, more drugs basically is more resistant bugs, is kind of the takeaway from that. That's what overuse of antibiotics is doing on a population-wide scale. But for individuals, for you or me or anybody in the room taking antibiotics, every time that you take a full course of antibiotics, you elevate your risk for an infection for the next 6, 8, 12 months, depending on which study you look at. So your likelihood of acquiring a new infection after you clear that old one is way elevated. And the more antibiotics you take, the higher and higher the risk goes. So that's something that I want to take a step back and say, why is medicine making us more vulnerable to disease? Antibiotics just don't play well with your immune system. They kill off everybody. It's like chemo for bacteria. It just kills off all the cells. And so our immune system is regulated and balanced by this healthy populations of bacteria that live everywhere, live in your gut, in every part of your body. They are hugely disrupted by taking antibiotics to kill off the bacteria that are also making you sick. So in that time afterwards, your gut, every part of your body is just void of these really important bacteria that regulate health. And so your likelihood of getting sick after you take the medicine is that much higher. That's really important not to say that you should stop taking antibiotics if you have an infection. You should definitely take the antibiotics when you have an infection. But given the risks, there's a lot of evidence to say that that's not a good first line of defense necessarily. That's not necessarily what you should be prescribed as a kind of knee-jerk reaction to any type of infection. So let's take a step back and say, what is antibiotic resistance and why does this matter? Antibiotic resistance is mostly just genetic material that bacteria can both reproduce and sort of pass down through generations and also share back and forth. There are a lot of different flavors of antibiotic resistance, sort of as many as there are types of drugs. So a particular gene or type of gene will say, give whoever has that gene the ability to resist penicillin or penicillin-type drugs. But antibiotics come in a lot of different flavors too. So for every type of drug we have, there's sort of a gene or a cluster of genes that encode for resistance to that drug. Some of these bacteria hold all the cards, and there's nothing you can throw at them that will kill them. So if you get infected with one of those, that's game over, unless your body is healthy enough to fight off the infection itself. So bacteria have this incredibly special mechanism that no other higher life form has. We use the term higher loosely because this would be incredible if you could do this. But normal genes get passed down, parents to children to grandchildren to, down through different generations. But bacteria have a lot of different ways of just taking a gene for whatever, throwing it across whatever small bacterial ecosystem they're living in, chicken gut, your skin, whatever, pile of crap on the floor. And they can, not only can one E. coli that is drug resistant give a gene to another E. coli and make it drug resistant sort of in real time, and then allow them to both reproduce and make more and more resistant E. coli. But the E. coli can reach out to a salmonella in the same gut and exchange genes across species, which is something they only really discovered in the last few years. So it's kind of this mechanism that makes the transfer of genes so much more rapid and efficient and complex. So the ways in which, and every time that we, not only are we selecting for the genes that are resistance genes, but we're selecting for the genes that allow the more rapid sharing of genetic material, because that's also beneficial for survival of all of these bacteria. So with that, there's really nothing that we can do to get out in front of kind of like the arms race between lethal bacteria and drugs that kill lethal bacteria, because they will always have these mechanisms that are so much more rapidly adaptable to the environment than we can produce, sort of a harsh environment that will kill them. So how do we become exposed to drug-resistant bacteria? That's a good question, and there are a whole lot of answers to that question. I don't know if any of that sort of transfers. This is a slide that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, just made and published. It sort of details the different ways in which antibiotic-resistant bacteria both arise and then are spread to human communities. On the left side of the slide, you see like livestock. They have a cow, a chicken, and a pig. They're getting fed the antibiotics, the feed antibiotics that we were talking about. This breeds a bunch of resistant bacteria in the gut, that gets onto the meat, that gets into the slaughterhouse, that gets into the food supply chain, and you then have people getting exposed through their food or through mishandling food somewhere along the food supply chain, exposing them to these bacteria. Another route is this guy goes and takes antibiotics and he gets sick and he goes to the hospital and he acquires a new infection there or is exposed to an antibiotic-resistant bug there, he brings it home, his kids get exposed, or he goes to work and his coworkers are exposed. So humans are a really important transfer mechanism for like drug-resistant bacteria to both arise when we take antibiotics and then to move around into different communities when we just sort of travel throughout our lives. And it goes through the food system, it goes through the healthcare system, and it circulates and it grows and it gets better and better at living in different environments because it has more time to adapt. So what does this basically all mean for today? Today, there have never been higher rates of infection, hospitalization, and death globally and in this country from antibiotic-resistant infections. Bugs like multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis, which were unheard of a decade ago, are really common. There were over 60 million cases of drug-resistant tuberculosis, I think, globally last year. Bugs like MRSA, which is a staph infection that is resistant to penicillin and other drugs, are becoming really common. And there are some new bugs, like fully drug-resistant gonorrhea, which can now kill you. That's fun. That was discovered this year. And was discovered in Canada, then Japan, now the US, so now you can get a STD that will kill you. That's awesome. Overall, the healthcare environment, doctors' offices, hospitals, other healthcare settings are still a place that is where most people acquire these types of antibiotic-resistant infections, which makes sense. That's a place where a huge number of antibiotics get used. But those are actually down somewhat in the last couple of years, while the number of just community-acquired cases, so people who weren't necessarily visiting a hospital, weren't necessarily exposed to the food supply chain directly by working in a slaughterhouse or something, are still coming up with these drug-resistant infections. So the takeaway from that is just that these bugs are getting much better at living in a bunch of different human environments. So they're not just confined to the food system anymore. They're not just confined to the hospital anymore. They move freely through a bunch of different human environments. So what does that mean for the future? No one knows. It's really, really bad already. And every trend is in the wrong direction. We keep pumping drugs into these environments that keep generating and circulating these drug-resistant bugs, and it just gets worse, and they just get more resistant, and every couple of months, something that's never picked up drug resistance before is now fully resistant. See, gonorrhea. That's awful. And an upcoming era of more bugs being resistant to more drugs seems pretty much inevitable at this point. How bad it gets is really the only remaining question. And the doomsday scenario is back to the dark ages. It's back to you get a bad infection and you're fucking dead. And that's really serious. We go back to a point where infectious disease is what kills most people. And that currently is only true in parts of the developing world, but that could become the norm in a scary quick way all over the world. So, yeah. No. Not in like a meaningful way. There hasn't been this like meaningful push from any angle to regulate the amount of the use of these drugs, which is really the name of the game at this point. If you don't take meaningful action on that, everything else is just superficial. And it's really hard to get the relevant regulatory agencies to admit that there's a problem. Until recently, CDC really would have never published that slide you just saw. That was sort of a breakthrough moment for them, and that's just sort of admitting that the shit is already through the fan. And that's a bad thing. That said, they admitted there's a problem, that's something. But there's really huge money behind the status quo on this one. Those 80% of antibiotics that go into animals are probably the most contentious use of those drugs, and the big pharmaceutical companies will fight tooth and nail because that is their profit margin to keep that in place. And there's just, those people have their shit together in a way that makes Citibank look like the children. The pharmaceutical companies and the big food companies mean business in a way that, I mean, they have these people by the short hairs, and it's pretty amazing. The amount of control that they can exert over the regulatory environment. It's also really hard to get out in front of this problem. There's strong evidence to suggest that if we stopped using all of this today, it might kind of just be like climate change. We're screwed anyway, we set this in motion. And it might just be too late to stop. We have created these genes, they circulate freely. If we remove the pressure for them, we might not make new ones, but these might find their way into all kinds of new environments. So that's the argument that a lot of the companies that will admit that there's a problem put forth when you say, like, you need to stop putting some of your drugs to be used in livestock. They'll say, even if we stopped, it would make a difference. And these are these people's profit margins, you got to protect the profit margins. So the other problem is that a technological fix, a new drug, a new vaccine, something like that, is just going to be a temporary solution if it works at all. And that's not, to the powers that be, that's not a really good investment of research dollars. So they're putting it elsewhere. And that kind of leaves this hurtling towards a cliff and fewer and fewer guardrails between us and that cliff. And this has, I think, like that potential to just be like explosive. I think this might trump every other health issue in the 21st century. And there's a lot of people who are smarter than me who think similarly. And it's real interesting and real scary, and I'd be happy to take any questions, I guess.
I always have a question. That was awesome. Can you talk a little bit about MRSA and such on food itself, and sort of some of the studies you've done, like chicken?
Yeah, MRSA is methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. It's a really common infectious disease. It's found in hospitals, and it's found in food, and it's found in a lot of different human communities. A few decades ago, it was only heard of very rarely in hospitals. It's become kind of like the banner microorganism for antibiotic resistance. It's real good at not giving a shit at what we throw at it and killing people. I think they just published 2011 statistics, and something like 90,000 people died of antibiotic-resistant infections, and fully more than 10% of that were MRSA infections. So this is a fucking serious bug. On food, there's a distinction to make. Multi-drug resistant, which is basically the same thing as MRSA Staph aureus, has been found on over 50% of industrial system commercial chicken products, and a little bit higher on ground beef. Really 1 out of 2. So that is to say, like, you are exposed constantly through the food system. If you eat fully cooked meat, you will not be infected that way, but if you handle it properly, it gets into your home environment. It's really good at surviving a lot of stuff. It's good at surviving your antimicrobial hand soap. And Sarah's point that it's highly prevalent on food brings to mind to me one of the least studied and most important transfer routes that these bugs have for getting from livestock, which are just a breeding ground for this, to a human population. So I think that's a highly relevant source for exposure. That said, nobody's done the research that would say, like, this percentage comes from that, this percentage comes from hospitals and elsewhere. So I think it's a lot that of the illness that we experience results in exposure to the food system, but nobody knows exactly how much.
So, if you ate like some chicken that had MRSA, that was contaminated with MRSA.
Hopefully you cooked it.
Okay, but just say, okay, let's say you were handling it and somehow it like got into your digestive tract.
Most of us are healthy enough to resist.
Okay.
But the thing is that at that point you can become a carrier. You can be colonized in the nose, in the mouth, on your hands, on your skin. And at that point, if you go handle a baby, if you go have a contact or exposure to someone who's immunocompromised, if you you who treat a lot of people
Yeah.
who come to you for various illnesses and might already have something that's compromised their immune system. If
Yeah.
you are exposed to that, if you're carrying that, and not getting sick, because you're healthy,
Right.
because your immune system functions and we're better than any
I
drugs.
think my question was like, it was my understanding that MRSA infection was more of like a skin thing, like it appears on your.
Most manifest on the skin, but if you
Right.
can get a bloodborne infection also, and those are often the ones that it starts as a skin infection, it becomes a bloodborne infection. It's a vital organ and then death.
But can it go from the inside?
Rarely.
Rarely.
Rarely. But yes, that's completely possible, but again, that's an understudied thing. I can't say with certainty, but generally speaking, if you ingestion is not a route that you're going to get infected from. It's usually superficial skin stuff.
Yes, that was my question.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah,
you.
totally. But that colonization thing is a really important thing. They did a study a little while ago that showed 60% of people were carrying around staph in their nose. And healthy. You're not getting sick, but that means you get sick, automatic exposure. You expose someone who is sick or is a baby or doesn't have a fully functioning immune system for one reason or another, you have exposed them to something that you are carrying. You become the vector, is what the science people say, between the bug and its ultimate person who is going to get sick. Jeffries?
Sorry, I missed some of the lecture, so maybe you already covered this, but
Okay.
I was wondering if you knew anything about the difference between, if there are differences between the meat industry in America and meat industries in countries that do things differently. Is our model just like
Oh, yeah.
textbook
That's a good
of everything
question.
you should do and there are places where it's better, or does it kind of not matter?
Depends on what system you're talking about. Healthcare systems, food systems, with regard to like trying to prevent the spread and occurrence of these bugs. The poster children for control of this stuff is the Netherlands. The Netherlands take this so seriously because they had it some of the first cases. And they screen everybody at entry to any hospital on the nose for MRSA. They screen their food like nobody else, and they prevent. Their occurrence is lower than ours by a long shot. And they've stopped the use of antibiotics in most of their livestock production and have watched slowly a decline. But not as dramatic as you'd think. It's lower, and they're doing a much better job than we are. That said, they stand out for doing one of the only good jobs around. Because these are multinational businesses, that they set the standard and they go to the place where the standard will be met. And so that's why the Dutch, it don't allow Purdue, it don't allow ConAgra to do business there because they have these standards, and that's why they don't bother. But China is loosening standards, and we're expanding to China, and American businesses are expanding to China because they have even looser legislation, even looser inspection. But those products are going to get sold right back to us, and so there's worse actors. The trend overall is down. There are a few people who are exemplars of really, really good management of this problem.
I was just wondering if you, in your ideal regulatory system, what would you recommend?
Another lecture.
Yeah.
I suppose you'd start with not allowing antibiotics to be used in livestock production. That is exactly where I would start. And that's exactly where you'd run into an immovable roadblock if you're a regulator. So we're talking in pure hypotheticals already. But there's a lot that could be done smarter in terms of the way they track antibiotic use, the way that they basically are just kind of paid to do whatever pharmaceutical companies tell them to do. If you were to start anywhere, you'd start with the low-hanging fruit, which is to stop feeding low-dose antibiotics to livestock, because that's just easy. But you'd also then have to start changing the way that you raise livestock almost instantly because just keep them in a pen, 5 million to a pen, and you're going to have all die if you don't feed them antibiotics. That is legit, but that's not a legit way to raise animals, so that's a whole different discussion too. So at that point, you're talking about like 10 different regulatory agencies, and that's why they're not going to be leading the way on this one.
I know your world is like a bacterial world, but are you seeing similar adaptive mechanisms in viruses?
Shit, yeah, all the new viruses are, well,
It's a whole
yeah.
other discussion.
Well, they're also all out of the food system too, you know, like your avian flus and your swine flus and your hybrid flus.
So
Those
how do
are.
they adapt to this? I know there's no antibiotic resistance sort of compelling that.
Oh, I use antivirals, sure, yeah, no, it's,
Antivirals,
yeah, but they don't have the same reproductive mechanisms. It's
Right.
more complicated in some ways and it's less studied, but it's not a different thing altogether. It's selective pressure for the ones that will survive exposure to the drugs. But the mechanism of evolving those defenses is different. And I don't know that much about it. Adam?
Is this just like, you're mostly talking about like livestock and like meat and stuff like that. What about like dairy products or any other sort
Yeah.
of vegetables or fruits or things like that?
Well, I mean, sure, yeah, yeah, exactly. That's a really good point, Adam. They start on the livestock, but every totally fucked up foodborne outbreak illness that you've heard about ever started on livestock and probably ended up on a cantaloupe or spinach or something like that you eat raw. And yeah, that's because they spread manure from cattle, from chicken, from swine, which is rife with this stuff, fresh on the fields. They spray it. And that directly contributes to all of that illness and exposure. Yeah, meat's where the origin, livestock is the origin. Often, yeah, meat's not the one because you cook it. And more frequently than not, that might be how it gets into your home, but that's not the really nasty foodborne illness you're going to hear about. That's going to be on fresh produce a lot of the time. But it started in the same place. And it started with the overuse of antibiotics in animals whose manure was eventually used as fertilizer for those crops. So it's a little bit more of like this multi-step thing through a few different environments, but it's got the same origin.